My name is Ian Foster, and I would like to introduce the proposal put forward by the Classic Autocycle Museum to reuse the ex-magistracy building in Fanling as a motor museum. Why we think this building is appropriate is the scale, and why we think it's appropriate to have a motor museum in Hong Kong is that our city has enjoyed 100 years of undisturbed motoring development in the city. Whereas across the border in China, come 1959, that history stopped. Any motor vehicles that had been in China prior to 1959 were lost during the Cultural Revolution. So nowadays, the stock of classic cars in Greater China exists in Hong Kong. So we want to make Hong Kong the focus for that classic car appreciation and for the culture of classic cars. We want it to be focused in Hong Kong. Taking on a tour around the proposed museum. On the main elevation here, the main entrance, we would still use this main entrance during marketing or entertainment events. When we would lease out the facility to people like Dunhill, DBS, Louis Vuitton, etc., who have expressed interest in such a facility in Hong Kong, a motor museum facility in Hong Kong. But that would be the main entrance only on special occasions. What we would like to do is use the entrance at the side of the building. This is a very attractive entrance coming through some mature trees, some grass areas. Both making it an attractive entrance and also an attractive place for the coffee shop to spill out onto. Coming into the museum, we would come through that coffee shop or restaurant, passing by the servery, seeing that that facility exists when you come to the museum. That facility would also sell motoring books, toy cars for the children, etc. The main entrance to the museum proper itself would be from that coffee shop. And having spoken to all the administrators of the existing government museums in Hong Kong, they advised me not to charge any fee for the public to come into the museum, thus maximising the number of people coming to see the museum. So we want to give free access to the public coming into the museum at this point. Once into the museum, we would route the people up to the first floor area. Once to the top of the stairs at the first floor, we would give them the opportunity of coming into an introduction in a lecture theatre, reusing one of the existing courtrooms in the courthouse. After that, they would come on a route through introductory panels telling them about the history of motoring development in Hong Kong, the history of roads, how they were built, etc. In Hong Kong, coming through an exhibit that then would step through the decades, starting in the 1910s, going through the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, with a backdrop. For example, in the 1920s here, a backdrop showing what Hong Kong would have looked like and the densities of buildings, etc. in the 1920s. As we come through as well, we have a series of police and fire service department vehicles to display. All these are existing in Hong Kong. As you proceed through the museum, we come to the rear and come downstairs on an existing staircase at the rear, coming through the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, back onto the main area of the museum. And if you can imagine taking your children to this museum, for example, when you come to the 1950s, you're actually in a scene from the 1950s. You're not reading about history in a book in 2 dimensions. You're actually experiencing history in 3 dimensions, with the cars from the period, the motorcycles, the bicycles, mannequins dressed in period costume, etc. And with the scenery of the 1950s painted on the walls around that. So imagine yourself telling your grandchildren, or telling your children, this is the scenery, or this is the image that your grandfather would have seen when he was a child living in Hong Kong. So we want to make the museum something that is alive, not just for motoring enthusiasts, but for everyone in Hong Kong, everyone that's interested in culture. And what we'd like to do now is take you on a little route around Hong Kong, showing you some of the actual vehicles that are in storage in Hong Kong at the moment that can be taken immediately and used in the museum facility that we propose. We're approaching the 100th anniversary of motor vehicles in Hong Kong. Around about 1916, the first cars, motorcycles and buses started to appear on the roads here. Cars like the old Ford Model A here and the 1920s Sunbeam motorcycle. These are the kind of vehicles that we will start off the exhibit in the proposed museum. Because what we want to do is have people like yourselves bring your children to the museum and experience Hong Kong's history in 3 dimensions. Rather than reading about history in a book, we want children to see the history in 3 dimensions. So we will have vehicles like this sitting in a progression from 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, 40s, 50s, etc., showing what Hong Kong would have looked like in those decades. And remember, that's particularly pertinent for the tourists from the mainland, given that in 1959 China suddenly stopped having those vehicles from overseas, etc. So for the mainland tourists, we believe our museum would be extremely interesting for them to come to see. We also have an idea about this 100th anniversary to create a book for Hong Kong. Basically a book on the first 100 years of motoring, the progression of cars and roads, etc. in Hong Kong. All the proceeds from that book will come back into the museum project. Now we're in the 1950s. These would have been typical saloon cars for the wealthy people in Hong Kong. And for the decades from the 1970s onwards, we've got a number of cars to display. For example, this very prestigious E-Type Jaguar from 1973. And also, as far as motorcycles are concerned, we've got a number in the collection relating to Hong Kong. For example, the police motorcycles dating from 1942 through to 1983. We also have many race cars in our collection, like this ex-Jackie Chan car. And we have a selection of over 100 motorcycles that we can choose from to create a display in Phan Ling. Everything from the 1920s through to motorcycles from the 1970s, 1980s. Also a lot of memorabilia related to Hong Kong. Things like the old cars that would have been made in Hong Kong in the 1960s, etc. Old bus signs. All of these items can be moved to Phan Ling Museum immediately.